Cool. So we're at week 3, so we only have one more week after this week, which is I feel like these classes always move a lot quicker than I expect. So let's see, a couple housekeeping notes. So one, I apologize for screwing up co-working last week. I think with the day shift and then some work things, it just sort of like I kind of lost track of it. Since we'll be starting co-working classes or sessions a week before the final class, what I'll do is I'll just extend those for a couple weeks. So as a reminder, one thing we'll also do is at the end of this class, we'll do like a show and tell. So I'll send out a calendar invite for like the best time for that, although I have a guess it might be like this time. So I'll send that out this week for people to just sort of say what times work best for them. As a reminder, the show and tell is like a very like lightweight way to just share work that you made during class, or maybe I tend to find that people find the show and tell as a way to um, basically like force themselves to make a little bit of work after the class. So usually they're about 2 or 3 weeks after the class is over. That way it gives everyone a little bit of time to just sort of like rewatch some materials, maybe decide on a little project to make, and then sort of sit down and do it. So obviously, like we'll do co-working sessions up until that time. That way, if people need help with a thing or like want to play with something, we can sort of walk through those together. Um, yeah, so I definitely recommend like everyone should feel free or welcome to take part in those. Um, I yeah, I think it's good if it's like I would definitely encourage everyone to because it's just fun and it does sort of motivate you and it's sort of like a nice end of the class moment. But again, they're optional. I should also say like if you are not a public presenter and you want to record your session, you're more than welcome to record your session and then just send it to me and I can play the recording during the show and tell. So this should all be like as less anxiety inducing as possible. But just to put that out there, like I think it's a fun thing for everyone to take part in. So I will send out an invite for that, and then I will also just remind everyone about co-working sessions every week. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about some of the work that got shared in Slack this week. Go ahead and share my screen, and then just oops. Let's see. There we go. Oops. Do I have Slack open? I do not. Let me open up Slack real quick. So Alana couldn't be here today, but I did see that she shared a video, which I thought was pretty cool. Actually, Sarah, this has some very Len Lai vibes in some ways. Um, uh, yeah, I think it's really great, and I love the. I wonder what she did to do the sort of jumping effects. I wonder if that's either a filter or if that's just the video itself that she was sort of cutting and editing together. But the sort of RGB shift is fun. I like it. Maybe we can ask her in Slack about how she went ahead and produced that. And Chris, I saw you shared some cool stuff. Do you want to talk through what you were working on?
Yeah, I'll say that I didn't get much further than playing with some of the basic filters, but I just was going through and trying them all, which is its own labor, I suppose. Um, but I found this one called Lag Fun, which is one of those like silly named things that actually does something that I used to try and do in After Effects for years and years and years by like duplicating layers and overlaying them and time offsetting them. And like this shit would take like 5 days to render. And it was like 30 seconds in FFmpeg with this silly named filter. So like, yeah, light trails with FFmpeg turned out to be super crazy easy. Um, yeah. And then in the other piece, I was playing a lot with uh, I added a whole bunch of bilateral filters, which gave it this really nice sort of stretching effect. Although I don't think you can see it too well here. And then I ended up doing an overlay combining the footage back with the bilateral filtered footage. So I was doing a lot of that of like processing, and then add it back on top of the original. And I kind of liked where this got to.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's really cool to sort of see some of these, and I agree. I think there's some really fun stuff that's sort of buried within various components of FFmpeg that are definitely easier than trying to do stuff in After Effects. I think the light trails is a great example. Um, we'll look actually like the first thing we'll do in class today is actually look at some of the blend mode lists, and you'll see that there are various blend modes that are also like not the normal like Photoshop or After Effects blend modes. So I think there's also some opportunity to play with some of those. I was playing with a couple of them this week and didn't really find any that were too different than what I would expect, but I do think there's some options in there. So yeah, play with lag fun as well. It looks like there's some interesting stuff to be done there. Cool. So yeah, I'm really excited to see stuff, people sharing things. Oh, and Tom, it looked like you figured out uh, your hue rotation piece a little bit.
Sorry, I've got two monitors and the mouse got lost.
No worries.
Yeah, so most in Blender just making animations, but I did this one last week from a screen cap um, of this 3D model that I made, just doing a basic rotation. And when I threw it into the hue thing last week, I was like, wow, that's brilliant. And I particularly like the way that the rotation of the forms as they're tumbling then occlude each other and repeat each other through this kind of filtering. And I think the thing that I want to try next with this is to increase the number of overlays and then also to change the hue rotation so that one is rotating 180 and one is rotating 360, and also maybe have one rotate minus 360 and one rotate 360 so that they're looping back and around. I mean, in an ideal world, I want to find it so that the exterior one, same hue at the start and the finish so that it loops perfectly. I think that's the thing that I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around at the moment. And that's what I was sort of chatting about in the thing. But yeah, and there's an artist that I can't think of that this reminds me of. And it's not William Wegman, although it is William Wegman, because he does all those dog photos on the bright backgrounds. But there's somebody else, and I can't for the life of me think who it is. But anyway, yeah, I had a lot of fun with this. I did another one where I had like a 3D scan of a stairwell, and you went up the stairwell, or you went down the stairwell and then back up. But that one didn't work as well for this, but it might work nicely for lag fun. So I'm going to try that with lag fun, see what happens. Yeah. Yeah, it was a cool week.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, looping is like one of the more challenging parts of FFmpeg, in part because you can't just say take the beginning and the end and like figure it out. Right? The way that I've sort of realized that FFmpeg works is it works sort of just purely forward. It's a forward pass essentially, right? It just reads and reads and reads until it ends, and it just says, okay, I'm done. There's no sort of like look up the end first and then work your way backwards, or like figure out the length and then do it. So you have to do some manual work. So yeah, it's one of the challenges with this sort of tool workflow. But I think we figured out a little bit of how that should work. We'll look at it again as well a little bit today, because I think the key is, if you know the length of your video beforehand, that'll sort of allow you to tweak various things, right? So we were sort of discussing, essentially taking the value, and if you divide that by, or if you divide 360 by the length of your video, then you've got sort of like how many rotations per second, and then it's just sort of about using various values to sort of manipulate that. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot more to be done here, and it's you know I think the other helpful part is that if you need to brute force it using Python, you can in something like Colab, or you'd have to figure out how to write a Bash script to do that um, in using like the terminal command line. So I think there's lots of opportunities, and maybe that's something that we can look at a little bit more in a co-working session for anyone that's interested. Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into our work for this week. So sort of the theme for this week's class will be, well, first off, it'll be kind of two. We'll look at blending and masking, because I know that some folks had asked about masking. So we'll look at how to do that this week. It's, again, I would say it's probably maybe a little bit more annoying than, well, it's about the same amount of work as After Effects. It's just a different workflow. You sort of have to generate your images, your masks outside of FFmpeg, either in something like OpenCV or something like ImageMagick or Photoshop or After Effects itself. And you have to sort of bring that into FFmpeg. Because there aren't really, there are some very rudimentary drawing tools within FFmpeg, but I would say they're like definitely not worth. You're much better off going to have like better results just using some other tool like Photoshop or something. So we'll look at that. We'll look at blending a little bit, and then I think for the most of the class, we'll spend working with sort of what I would describe as timings. Oh yeah, of course. Thanks, Sarah. I will share this week's notebook, and I'll also make sure.
I thought I just missed it.
Nope, just haven't shared it yet. There you go. Yeah, and then I think most of what we'll focus on this week will be timings.
Okay.
So we'll look at stuff like offsetting video, or potentially, adding a little bit of buffer beforehand. So we'll actually look at how to do like a slit scan technique using a video. And then we'll go through how to maybe do some shifting of time using like an offset for like a looping video, and a couple other things. So I think this will be good to just sort of explore with like how timing works within FFmpeg as well. All right, so I went ahead and, again, I actually don't think this week, unlike last week where I said I don't think we're going to need to use the newest version of FFmpeg, and then we did for RGBA shift. For this week, I don't think we actually will, but I went ahead and ran this anyway. Just know that this takes a little bit of time to update, so if you're going to go ahead and do that, you might fall a little bit behind us, but go ahead. So let's start with some blend modes. So obviously, one of the first things you might want to try to do in FFmpeg is just layer two videos on top of each other. And there is, in fact, a blend mode set up inside of FFmpeg. And as I mentioned previously, one of the interesting things about the blend modes available to you in FFmpeg is that, you've got your average, your regular ones, sort of like multiply, averaging, darken, difference, those sort of things. But there are also some other ones in here that I'm sort of interested in what these are, like what is grain extract? Or I believe I was playing with Phoenix, and I think what else was I playing with? There's a couple others in here that I hadn't really seen before. So you might want to just grab those and play with these a little bit and see what you get. I believe Phoenix was something like some sort of different thing, but then also maybe like an edge detection filter, like maybe using some sort of Sobel filtering. So you got some sort of interesting effects with some of these things. So all of these will take in, you pass in these values, and it will take, I believe, 2 videos. I don't think you can do more than 1 video, but I could be wrong about that. And then apply that filter to those 2 videos. So this is the syntax for this. So you'll just, you will have to use the filter complex, right? Because we have 2 inputs. So you'll pass in your first video and pass in your second video. And then you just use blend equals, and then whatever that filter you want to be using is. One note that you might come across like pretty frequently when playing with multiple videos, if you have videos of different lengths, I believe by default it will take the longest video and sort of like render to that length, which means when your shorter video completes, it just sort of stops, like, right, and then you just get the output of the one longer video. If you want to change that, which most people probably do, the way to do that really easily is to just pass the -shortest argument. And when you run this, let's go ahead and run this because it might take a second or two to. Whoops, what did I do wrong here? There we go. This will essentially just whenever it hits the end of the second video, just stop. So it'll just render out that shortest length. So this is a pretty common one. I will definitely come across this in many cases, especially this week as we begin to play with the lengths of these things. So we'll just go ahead and let this render and see how this goes. And I always recommend checking out the examples in the FFmpeg when there actually are examples. Um, Usually there's some sort of like really funky stuff that they show as examples in here. So this is apply a transition from bottom layer to top layer in the first 10 seconds. So here again, you'll see we're using some expressions. And what I assume this is doing is it's doing some sort of, it takes that blend mode and it only applies it for the first 10 seconds. So it sort of transitions between these. So this is looking pretty complicated, but it might be fun if you want to sort of start to break down what's actually going on here. Let's see, apply linear horizontal translation from top layer to bottom layer. Okay. Checkerboard effects. So, what I would definitely recommend doing is just sort of take these into FFmpeg or apply them in the command line and just sort of drop these in here and see what happens and maybe play with some of these values, right? So you might want to look up like, what is y? Well, I assume y has something to do with the x and y coordinates. What is sh? Sh is the height scale. Okay, I'd have to probably look into what exactly that means. But yeah, so again, this gets really complex and there's so much you can do within these things. But I think there's a lot of fun that you could have with these pieces. So it could be kind of fun to just sort of explore what all these do.
Derek?
Yeah,
Just
go for it.
Quick question. Do you understand or can you explain briefly how they kind of talk about planes?
I don't actually. I haven't really come across this before. It is the ratio between the dimensions of the current plane to the Luma plane. So
Found some other
yeah.
found some other places and it was like all the planes are actually because you could separate RGB
Mm,
into
It sounds like the
planes.
word they're using for channels.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
that's what I was thinking. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you, Stefan. I was
that would
like,
make
there's got to
sense.
be a simple way.
Yeah, channels. I mean, Luma would make sense, right? Because there you can then also have a luminance channel in addition to RGB, depending on how you process it all. Yeah. So, yeah. This is in reality this is probably a 10-week class to get into all this stuff, but I think there's lots of fun options here. And this is probably the same as sort of say our the time expressions that we were looking at last week, except with the addition of sort of like X and Y and pixel coordinates. I've definitely seen, like I was mentioning, that there's some rudimentary drawing tools in FFmpeg, and basically those are like shader, like sort of language drawing stuff, right? So it looks at X and Y coordinates, that sort of thing. So I am not really a shader person, so I'm probably not the right person to describe those tools. But if you have some rudimentary like shader experience, you will probably understand like, oh, here's how you draw a circle by doing a distance function or that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a ton of opportunity in some of these where there are a lot of good examples. Just sort of go through the examples one by one and sort of break them down that way. Let's see if we got our video here. Looks like we did. All right, so while that downloads, because it looks like my download speed might be a little slow. Also, that is a huge file. Interesting. I wonder if my loop file is very long. Anyway, so that's blend modes. Again, this is pretty simple. I bet it would be fun to also see, like, use this in addition to maybe like some of the overlay filters, right? So where we're doing overlays, again, because you take in two videos, you could also apply a blend mode to those. So it might be kind of fun to explore that. All right, masking. So masking, is fairly similar in the same way. What you'll see here is that in this case, what we're doing is we are applying a video, a loop, and then we are also adding in an image. So we're adding in a mask. And in this case, my mask is set up like this, right? So we're doing some green screen stuff. Masking generally does use an effect called Chroma Key, which means you can use it and it'll find a color. You basically give it the color value, and then it will look for that color value in the image, and it will turn those pixels transparent. So the argument for this is what you'll see what we're doing here is we are taking in our video and we are taking in our image and we're applying them as an overlay, right? So we're going to overlay. One thing I should note is if you can't tell, this is transparent. So in the middle, we've got transparent pixels. So we're just going to overlay the this masked image on top of our video. And again, it's kind of funny because each of these effects sort of have a built-in default. This built-in default is, you might say like, well, this is only essentially one frame of a video, right? So like, wouldn't it just blip and then disappear? And the way FFmpeg decides how to overlay images and video together is that it will overlay the image for as long as the video lasts. So it'll just repeat that, essentially that frame over and over and over again. So when you use overlay, it'll just basically like mask this on top of the entire duration of the video. Next, we'll look at the Chroma Keys. So this is actually where we convert our video to transparent pixels. So what you do with Chroma Key is you pass in a color, and in this case, they usually recommend that you do some sort of hex code. So this is a hex code for that bright green. This is like that full like RGB green. And then the next two values here, this is, if you sort of know about anti-aliasing, this adapts for sort of anti-aliasing. So essentially, if this were set to 0, this would only find pixels where this absolutely matches this value. So because we've got a little bit anti-aliasing in that PNG, we want to sort of account for like little green edges where we've got some softening. So this value goes from 0 to 1. If you set it to 1, it'll basically find every color in the spectrum. If you set it to 0.5, it'll find like, I don't know, there's some calculation there where it does like sort of multiplies and finds a close value, but not the perfect value. I had to play with this a little bit to make sure that I got the right value. One of the things that happens fairly frequently is you'll get a little bit of that green halo in your final output. So you kind of have to crank this up and down a little bit to just sort of like account for that. So it might be different depending on what type of video you have. I'm actually going to run this, and then I'll keep talking through this while we do this. The other value is what I believe is called similarity. Let's actually look this up here. So if we go Chroma Key. Oh, sorry, the first value is similarity, and the second value is called blend. And blend will take those same pixel values and apply a blending, like sort of a softening or transparency to them. This one is also, I kind of had to play with these a lot because the examples I found on the internet like didn't really match my experience. Both of these operate on this color channel, but it isn't always like just blending. It's a little strange. It's sort of like it finds green values in the non-blended or the non-transparent images. Like you would sort of think this would just erase all of these values. So therefore, what are you blending? But instead, it actually finds some other frequency or like some other like various color spectrum that applies to this and applies a little bit of blend. So if you turn this up, you'll get some really interesting effects where it sort of like softens or like slightly transparents like various colors within your image. So I definitely recommend playing with this because you get some interesting effects. But you sort of have to like, in my experience, you sort of have to play with each of these values a little bit. I would definitely start this one on the lower side and start this one, 0.1, 0.2, just to make sure that you are removing sort of that green edge. So let's look at this, what this produces. So she'll say like, just for example's sake, what I did is I also took the video. So again, we're sort of just going to have a circle in the middle, but I took the video and I flipped the background video. So we're taking the background video and just placing the transparent image over top of it. I think that's helpful, especially for sort of debugging, because it sort of helps you show where this blending is happening. And then we're just overlaying those two. So this will sort of show like a circle in the middle with our video, and then it should have the other, the same video, but just sort of vertically flipped in the background. So there we go. So there you see this. And I should say you can barely see the green edge in some examples right here. So again, I might have to play with that blend mode a little bit. One of the challenges, as I'm sure you know with chroma keying, is that if you crank it up too much, it might find these green values, right? And then it might start to erase these values. So you don't have to do like purely like bright green values, right? And you don't have to generate your own mask. You could also say, take a video of something like a sky with clouds and just choose like a blue hue or a blue color and play with these values, and you might begin to erase the sky but keep the clouds, right? So this is not purely like it has to operate on some like single channel mask. Whatever your color value is here could be something that operates just purely on the video itself. So be aware of that. What you would do then is you wouldn't need the overlay. You would just sort of chroma key the video and then overlay it in another case. So this is probably a pretty powerful tool. And you might want to play with sort of just like removing certain parts of your video based on color range. There are actually a bunch of different color range sort of options. There's another one called color. Oh, that is not the thing to search for here. Let's go in here and see if there's, so there's one called color hold. And color hold will actually do sort of the opposite, which is that it removes everything else but that color. So if I wanted just that mask, I don't know, say like someone sent me like, let's say maybe I had the masked video where I had the green screen version and just the video, but like I'd lost my mask or something. You could actually use this to get out just the mask, right? So it's the same parameters. So you're providing a color, and then you are providing a similarity score and a blend score. And in this case, it says your color will be replaced with a neutral gray. So this is actually not going to create a transparent. So in order to create a transparent, I assume what you have to do is like a 2-pass where you would have to do the color hold and then find out whatever color that neutral gray is and remove that neutral gray with the chroma key or the color key. So kind of funky how some of these work. Yeah. So there's also, oh, okay. So this is the difference. I was trying to figure this out last night, and now in the cold light of day, I can. There's also one called color key. So it looks like chroma key operates on sort of an LUV channel. Color key operates on an RGB. So interesting how those are applied. I would have to play with this a lot more to try to figure out what the difference is between these two. It might also, again, just be like a developer decided like, oh, I want color key versus chroma key.
And you might get different quality results depending on like the sort of the origin of the video. Like a digital original video will probably respond better to color key than to the one that doesn't use RGB.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so depending on what you're doing, you might want to play with either of these. Their arguments are the same, which is also kind of confusing, right? You still pass in an RGB value, even to chroma key, because I guess it converts to an LUV channel. So yeah, you might want to play with these a little bit and just sort of see which one works best for you. I Googled a little bit last night and no one really knew how different they were. But I guess to Stefan's question, I guess if you have a video that's already in LUV, it might make more sense to do chroma key. If you have a video that's already in RGB, you might want to try color key and see what difference those are as well. That's a good question. So Sarah had a question of whether there was a Luma Mask. I don't know that there is. Let's see.
I feel like for my stuff, I use Luma masking a lot more.
There is, yep.
Because I'm less definite, so Luma masks are somewhat less definite.
Yeah, so there's a Luma key here as well, and it's a slightly different. It looks like it's slightly different parameters. So there's a threshold, a tolerance, and a softness. So yeah, so it looks like you can play with many of these different sort of keying aspects and see what works best for you. And then I won't run this one because this one takes quite a long time to render, and I would prefer not to spend half of the class just waiting on things to render. But this will actually, here, let me just show you what this video generates, which is, I believe, this. So this will generate a video that uses loops or uses a circle mask. And actually, you know what, this is a great point where I can sort of show you. I don't know how well this shows up over Zoom, but there's a slight sort of like halo on the green here. But yeah, so this one just does that masking. It does a mask, and then it sort of scales down each of those masks, so you get this sort of like nice sort of scaling effect. We'll look at this a lot more when we do some shifting of our timing as well. This is the code for how to do that. There's a couple tricks in here that I think are helpful to mention. So if you recall, I said that you can't really set a input directly in a filter, and then I said, okay, that's kind of a lie. This is how you can set a solid colored background video in without setting it as an input. So what you do is you pass in color. So you basically like pass in no input variable. You say color, and then you say the size equals, and I set the size the same as my video. You set the C, which is the color value, to black. You could set this to any RGB value. And then you set the duration to the number of seconds. So this is basically what I'm doing is I'm generating a 12-second, which is how long this video is, black background at the same frame rate as my video is. So, and then I set that to a variable of BG. So you can sort of like generate video inside of your complex filter. You could also do something, I believe. I don't think this would work with the color channel, but you could set something like T here probably, or like some other way to set that variable. So you could have sort of an altering color variable as just a pure background. So that's how we get this black background in this video. So then you'll see I'm doing basically the same thing I did here, which is I'm taking my overlay, my mask, and applying it to the video, and then I'm chroma keying out the video, and you'll see I've got different values here. So apparently I was still playing with this, and I did not figure out exact values here. Saving that to V1. Then we're doing the stuff we looked at last week, which is splitting that video into 4 pieces, scaling each one of those pieces, and then overlaying each one of them over top. So you're welcome to play with this code and sort of like tweak it as needed. You may find that it works better for you, or you may like certain parts of it, or you may just want to play with, maybe you want to generate a mask in Photoshop by just like using the pen tool or whatever and drawing your own mask and seeing what that sort of results out to. One note is this does take a long time to render. I assume that's partly because of this, because basically generating a video as it renders, or like generating a video and then rendering everything. So this was slow. I wouldn't be surprised if there's also something about scaling a chroma keyed effect. Like, I bet if I turned certain parts of this on and off, I would find that certain things work better. Maybe there's a performance hit of like chroma keying and then scaling. Maybe I should actually scale and then chroma key. Again, if you're like a performance person, this might be some fun stuff to play with and just sort of see what works best for you. But I did find this one took quite a while to render. Any questions? That sort of covers like what I was going to cover with just blend modes and masking. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about timing then. So I mentioned before that one of the things that's kind of a challenge with FFmpeg is that you don't really know the length of a video, right? Or at least FFmpeg does not know the length of a video. It's sort of like the way it processes, it just starts at the beginning of a video and it just like processes until it's done. So it doesn't really like look up how long a video is and then like go back and then like do that. So that can be pretty challenging. There's a tool called FFprobe that I generally will use to sort of get like some details about my video. Another thing is like you might know the frame, like how many frames are in your video, but you might not know the exact like, well, what does that convert to in seconds? Because remember that FFmpeg likes everything in seconds. So let's say, you've got 610 frames at 24 frames per second. You could like do that math. But I kind of like FFprobe because it tells me exactly sort of in FF language, like what length of this video is. So the way to use this is just to type FFprobe and then your input video. So we can go ahead and run this. And this will dump out sort of a bunch of stuff, much of which I don't exactly understand. But what I really look for is sort of this section here. There's sort of a metadata section, and then there is this sort of section right below it, which tells me, you'll see here, my duration is exactly 12 seconds, and start. So this is actually kind of important. We'll look at start and try to understand, well, like, why wouldn't start ever be 0? There's actually a case where if you trim a video and then save it out, you could actually have a start value that is higher than 0. And that will lead to all sorts of like confusing things that happen in your video. So we'll look at how to make sure that doesn't happen when we go forward. But just know that your start value could actually be higher than 0. And that will be very confusing. Some other nice things you'll see here is you'll see exactly what the codec is for this. So this is using a H.264 codec. This isn't super it isn't super common that like you'll need to use this. In some cases, there are actually I think maybe I'm trying to think about where you might run into issues with this. There are cases where if you're using two different codecs, actually with the concatenation filter, which we'll look at a little bit later, I think if you concatenate two videos in two different codecs, it'll either throw an error or it'll like lead to re-encoding, which can cause some problems in your video. So it is helpful to know what codec you're using. You might want to convert it before you like do stuff with it to a common one if you find something that's uncommon here. Next is helpful is the exact pixel dimensions. The frames per second is also really helpful. You will often find that some videos you find on the internet are 23.98 or 29.98. So, it's helpful to sort of know the exact frames per second as you work with things. And there's a couple other things that are in here that are helpful as well. So I find FFProbe, if I'm ever doing stuff with timing or other things, is helpful just for me to know the exact length of a video. That's usually the most common way that I use it, just so I make sure that this matches what sort of FFmpeg is expecting. And I think in Slack, I had mentioned to Tom, yeah, so there's a way if you want just purely the duration, you can run this command. What this sort of does is it pulls out this duration amount and it just formats it in a way that's really easy to read. So again, if you're building up sort of a library of FFmpeg commands, just to sort of keep on hand, I find this one to be pretty helpful. Because this just gives you the exact value instead of having to sort of parse through all this stuff. So you will often, as you Google around looking for things, you'll probably see some FFProbe examples. There are also ways. At the end of week 4, I will also just give you a dump of all of the commands that I have saved in a file that you can dig through. A really fun technique that I've been exploring with recently is actually using. Is it FFProbe? I think it is a FFProbe, but basically being able to save a bunch of values to a text file and then using that text file to create other effects from. So one of the things that I've been playing with more is there's actually a way inside of FFmpeg to detect when a scene changes. So basically it does a difference pixel value, and it's able to find where cuts are in videos, right? So let's say you take a movie that probably has 100 cuts in it, and you want to break each cut into its own sequence. There are ways in which you can do that in FFmpeg. So I'll probably share that next week just so people can see it. But there's lots of fun tools that you can sort of use at your disposal to sort of again, be able to create these smaller loops or smaller video pieces. So we will definitely look at that, or at least I'll mention it next week as well as share the code for that. So that's sort of a quick dive into FFProbe. So let's cover changing speeds really quickly. Again, one of the things you might want to do is you might want to set, I think Tom's video is a great example where you've got this video that's already looping. And Tom was mentioning that you might want to take the hue and have the hue change at a faster cycling rate in one part, or change in another, go slower at one point, faster at another point on just the hue. You could also look at doing that for your video itself, right? So you could say, okay, well, I want one of those crops to, since a full loop, I want it to cycle twice, and the time it takes another one to cycle at half speed or full speed, right? So you could then begin to do stuff like having hue cycling at different offset speeds, as well as your video cycling at different offset speeds. So you can do that with the set points filter. Or set PTS filter. I always call it set points because I just assume PTS stands for points, but it does not. PTS stands for presentation timestamp. So this is where we're getting into how does FFmpeg think about things, right? So we looked a little bit at T last week, we looked at N last week, but there's also PTS. And presentation timestamp is actually related to this start value. So if this start value were 2 and your video were 12 seconds long, PTS, which would be the presentation timestamp, when it started would actually be 2, and when it ended would be 14. So you may, again, we'll look at how this happens or why this happens. But this is an important thing to remember, is that PTS is not always starting at 0, depending on how your video is built. So that's why we use it, in fact, because in some cases that is a thing we want to leverage. So to set PTS, you will use the video filter of set PTS, and you'll multiply the current PTS, which is the capitalized version of PTS, times a certain value. And if you multiply it by a value less than 1, or again, divide by a value bigger than 1, what you end up with is it sort of shrinks the video down, right? It takes all those timestamps and it compresses it. So this will actually speed up your video. So let's go ahead and run this one. Oops, that's gonna.
And Derek, can you show us the before and after file size for that? Like, is it actually
Yeah.
changing the file size, or is it just speeding up how quickly they play?
Yeah, that's a great point. So this actually drops frames. So this does drop frames. So I assume it should be smaller. We'll take a look at the video file size when we're done, but it should definitely be smaller. All right, so if I hover over here, I will see that my video file is, let's just download this one. Take a look at it. All right, so this one you'll see is 25 megabytes, and this one is 14 megabytes. So it does actually, this drops frames. So again, you can't just like take this video then and then expand it and expect to see the frames show up. This does sort of like delete frames. On the flip side, and we can look at this video really quickly here. So the other video was, I believe, 12 seconds long, and you'll see this one is 6 seconds long. So on the flip side, you could multiply this value times something larger than 1, and that would actually slow your video down. So go ahead and run this. Do loop. And the important thing to know about this does not generate new frames. All this does is it takes your frame rate and it just duplicates a frame. So this will take your whatever frame 1 looks like, and at frame 2 it'll just duplicate it, and then it'll take frame 2, duplicate that. So there's no interpolation here. There is actually a way to interpolate if you're interested in that, and that uses down here. There is a M interpolate, which is motion interpolation. So if you want to generate sort of new frames within that video, you can. There's actually a really great article here that I'll link, that it's linked to in the notebook, about someone basically using this as a glitch effect. And there's some really great demos of different various arguments being used. So here they are using the motion interpolation and they're setting different values, and you can kind of see how this works. So it sort of takes chunks of the video and like moves them around, which again, what he's doing here is he's using it and purposely taking 2 distinctly different frames and sort of like creating some motion blur between them. In our case, since we're using an actual video, you would get like something that wouldn't be as weird looking. So yeah, there's lots of cool stuff you can do with this. And also, if you want to actually see like what happens, I did this as an example, which is I just ran 50 times to make sure that I got 50 frames of the same thing, and you do. So you can do some really funky stuff by sort of combining like a really slow speed with that motion interpolation, which is down here. Motion interpolation has a ton of different features. If we look at the documentation here, you'll see there's different modes, as well as scene change detection. So this is actually what I was talking about, where FFmpeg can figure out how different 2 scenes are. This scene change detection would say, don't motion interpolate between a cut in a video, right? Which is probably what you want to do if you're like slowing a video down and normally just trying to add frames. You wouldn't actually want to update a cut. because you'll get that weird effect that Antonio, I guess, was actually looking for. But maybe you do. So there's lots of different things in here. So again, if you're interested in playing with this to create some of these sort of glitch effects, I would definitely recommend reading this article because there's some really cool stuff in there.
Eric, just a quick question.
Yeah.
If you wanted to select just the areas that were the product of motion interpolation, like, is there a way that you could sort of assign those frames IDs as they're coming out, or like how would you have to put them in their own buffer? Like,
I mean, that's probably a case of where I would really do what I would actually do is I would run that code that does that scene change detection that I was talking about, and actually cut those into smaller videos, and then just do the motion interpolation between that. I guess your other thing would be, I'm sure there's a way to do this, I haven't really ever looked at it, but you could do something like this, where you've got one that is, let's see, I'm going to move this down here. Let's say you've got one video that is not motion interpolated, and then another video that is motion interpolated. There's probably some way within, actually I know there's a way within FFmpeg to actually detect between those two where the change is, the difference between these two. So that would probably be another way to do it. So there's lots of like,
that's great.
Yeah, so there's lots of techniques to do, and it's just sort of about finding the right one and then finding the right FFmpeg code to do that. But yeah, that would probably be what I would do, is I would just sort of use the same, create two different videos, one that is motion interpolated and one that isn't, and just like difference those.
Right. It seems like a lot of the time you end up wanting to use the video output itself as the sort of like indexical, unique identifier for the video that you're looking for. You know, and like it's harder to refer to them within the process than just to make them and then use them to refer to themselves, kind of.
Yeah. Sarah also said that you could also just do it mathematically, which is also true, right? Like this would be every second and third frame, or like using like a modulo variable, you would get that. The case where this wouldn't work is that some videos do have variable frame rates, and there, I believe the PTS will actually account for that. Don't quote me on that, but I believe so. This is where like there's a lot of dark corners of FFmpeg where they do have to account for things like variable frame rate videos and other things. Whereas I would just sort of like force them all to be the same frame rate. But yeah, there's probably worlds where there's dark corners or like edge cases where you have to think about with that. But yeah, there's sort of like with FFmpeg, there's lots of ways to skin the cat. And it's just about sort of finding what works for you, what gets you the right results, and that maybe you care about performance. I tend not to, just because I'm not really on a time crunch for any of these things. So if it takes a day to process, that's fine for me. But yeah, so like I think that would probably be, yeah, there's probably a couple different ways you could go about it.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so let's do, yeah, this is good. So let's do one more thing before we take a break. So we'll talk about concatenation. This is probably, again, like we're sort of like setting up a couple different things that we're going to be using later in class as we do more complex examples. So concatenation. Concatenation is just simply like adding two videos together, stacking them, sort of stacking, putting them side by side. I don't know what that would be. And by that I mean in time, not in space. So many things you have to think about together. So HStack is in space, you know, stack them one by one next to each other. This is more thing in a timeline perspective, right? You've got video 1, you've got video 2, and they just are playing sequentially. So we'll use that with concatenate. So that is the Concat filter. And if we look over here, I don't think there are too many examples, but let's just see. Yeah, so with concat, all you really have to do is set how many segments there are. The default is 2. And then we don't really, for this class, we don't need to worry about video streams and audio streams. But if there were multiple audio streams, you'd want to account for that. And if for whatever reason you're making multi-channel video, I guess you would account for that as well. In this, I'm going to assume that we all have single channel video, that sort of thing. So concat works fairly simply. You just provide your inputs. So I'm going to have an input of 2 videos, and then you will run the filter complex filter graph, and you'll just say, you know, what's the sequence that I want here. So the order does matter here, right? If I set 1 here and 0 here, what's actually going to happen is this video will play first, and then this video will play next. So you do sort of, I'm sure there's some reason why you might have your inputs in different orders, but in this case, you probably want to just do this one first, this one second. And if you did have more than 2, let's say I had a loop 3 video, you would want to account for that as well here. And then you would also want to say equals n equals 3. I believe in most cases, if you don't set this to be with the actual count value, it might throw errors if you pass in more than 1. Usually I just try to be like over explicit in these filters just to make sure that I account for those things. So in this case, you would just set n equals to 3, which I guess, for full explanation, we should just do this, just to be clear. Let's go ahead and run this. And of course, because I left that example in there, we go. So concatenation, as we'll look at, will actually be kind of fun when we have a looping video. So one of the things that we're going to look at the end of class, we're going to take a looping video, and we will actually cut off parts of the looping video and reorder them. And because the video loops, it doesn't, like if you would actually play this on a loop, you would never notice where that cut is. What this allows us to do is allows us to create some offsets where what we're going to do is we're going to take one video, we're going to chop off a second from the beginning and then stick it at the end. Then we're going to take another video of the exact same loop. We're going to take 2 seconds off, stack that at the end. And then what we've got like these looping videos that are looping in slightly different phases, and they're going to create some really fun effects. So that's what we'll look at in concatenation. So why don't we do this? Why don't we take let's do what is this? And I can't do math today. Let's just do a 10-minute break. So we'll come back at 10 after, and then we'll look at this video to make sure it played correctly. And then we'll jump into some slightly more complex examples for the rest of the class. Sound good? So I'll see everyone at 10 after. So I noticed that Sarah dropped in the Slack a video of the various blend modes. So it looks like she did difference, Phoenix, grain merge, and grain extract. So you might want to check out that video. Sarah, can you tell immediately if there's anything different between these? I mean, I can see they're different, but do you see anything that really highlights grain extraction or other things?
Well, the one thing I noticed is so the grain extract and the grain merge are on the bottom, and I don't know how they work still, except that if you pause it at any point, you can see that like in one case, the white values are being replaced, and in the other case, the dark values are being replaced, right? Like that these are the same images. So if you like look at the rectangle with the circle lines in between it, right? Like I think that shows like a really big difference in how that grain extract and grain merge are working, that the extract is preserving the white and the merge isn't. And yeah, and for context, the second video, which is the top, I believe is the top video, is just black and white. So I did that to look at the differences without sticking colors in to like make it a little bit clearer. But because of that difference isn't really changing the colors much, it is a little bit on the blue, but it does a nice job. Differences on top left. And that shows how like if you're using black and white, difference can be used to essentially serve as a Luma mask, right? Like it's sort of doing the same thing fundamentally. Phoenix, I don't really have any opinions about yet. It seems like it's preserving the white more again, but I'm not totally clear how that's the case in Phoenix, because if you look at Phoenix and difference there at the top, you can look at like the blue circle that's in the middle, and then just to the left, there's that rectangle. And in Phoenix, it's staying white. And in difference, it's turning black. And so that is also an interesting thing to notice. But yeah, basically I've been using HStack and VStack now when I'm testing out different things so that I can be like, what's really the difference? The answer is like, let's just stick them in a grid and then pause them.
Hey, if you take anything out of this class and it's HStack and VStack, that's great. I'm all for it. So yeah, this is really helpful. And I think like, again, this also points to like a really great use of HStack and VStack, or just like any sort of like comparison tool to be able to just sort of see what these look like. So I think there's again lots of opportunities even for debugging tools and that sort of thing. So this is really great and really helpful to sort of see compared to each other. So thank you for that. All right, so as I mentioned, for the rest of the class, we're going to look at timings. So I know, Chris, I think you had mentioned that you were looking at like, how do we offset time, that sort of thing. So I thought I'd cover maybe 2 examples of how to use offsets. One is going to use TPAD, and the other is going to, like I mentioned, use that a looping video, and we'll just sort of phase shift when it starts and stops. So this is how to use TPAD. So what TPAD is, T stands in most cases in FFMPEG stands for time. So this is time padding. So what we're going to do in this case is we are going to add a second, 1 full second of black video to the start of our to this video. So TPAD, oops, I dropped my filters page here. Let's look at TPAD. Oh, if T stands for temporary in this case, I'm going to be really mad. I'm going to assume it stands for time. I don't care what they say. I guess temporality and time are kind of the same thing, so whatever. So start, stop, start mode, stop mode. So one thing to know about TPAD is that you can add time to the beginning of a video, or you can add time to the end of a video. In this case, I'm going to be hacky and just add stuff to the beginning of a video. But one of your like homework quizzes or maybe tests for those of you interested in sort of like being challenged this way is, what would we do to add to both the beginning and end so that all of our videos are the same length? Well, that'll make more sense in just a second when you sort of see that example. But just know that you can add time to the beginning or the end of a video. And quite often what you do is you just specify a flat color. I think actually that's the only example you can do here. Yeah, so you have to add a color. So again, that syntax is, we're going to use start mode of add. I believe the other option instead of add is clone. So what clone would do, okay, so this is actually where I was discussing color or clone. Clone would just take the very first frame of your video and just like repeat it. So let's say you have a video of, well, in my case, I'll have a video of someone dancing. What it would do is just take that first frame of that like position and just repeat that until like the video started playing. So you can sort of decide what you want to do, whether you want to add or clone. And then let's see what else are we doing here. So we're setting the duration. So remember, pretty much all durations are always in seconds. So if you want less than the full second, you would set a fractional value. And then lastly, we're going to set our color here. So this will set a color of black. You could set it to transparent again, but just know that if you set it to transparent, your video codec has to support transparency, which most do not. Even if you set it to transparent here, it would like flatten it down to a gray. So I went ahead and ran this already. Let's just download it and take a look. So see, my video is black until the dance performance starts. So if we set this to clone, and I don't think we need that color, but let's just see, and we'll do clone. I wonder how long this is going to take. Okay, cool. We'll see we get just that beginning frame. And then it starts. So those are the 2 differences there. So what we're going to do for this is now we're going to create a slit scan effect. So a slit scan effect, if you've never done slit scan before, essentially breaks our video into a series of strips. And then it, like using that time offset, will generate like sort of a phase shift in various parts of the video. So as you move, you'll get sort of this like funky little like back and forth wavy effect. So a lot of times people use slit scan with like live video or that sort of thing. So it's a way to process sort of like, a live video in and out. Because we've got our TPAD here, we're actually going to pad our video a little bit so that we'll use each video for a part of these croppings. So let me actually just show what this looks like. So there's actually like 2 pixels of like little segments here. And as this generates, what you're actually seeing is a different part of the video at every one of these little segments. So it creates this like very interesting sort of twisty effect. It always works really well with dancing because you get these people who are like, you know, twisted and weirdly morphed in different ways. So in this case, I've written a Python script, and we'll go through the Python script to break it down. But basically, I've created a bunch of little, small little crops, and we're just using VStack to stack all these back together. So there's 2 pixels, and each 2 pixel row or strip is reading from a different video with that T-pad. So there's a slight offset to all these. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this does. So I've set up some variables here at the top. This allows me to create more flexible systems. This is one of the fun of using Python, is that once you've sort of set this up in a process, you can begin to create variables for these things to play with different, sizing effects, different offset timing effects, that sort of thing. So let's break these down. So first off, my video is 1920 by 1080. This will always be helpful because when you're doing cropping in FFmpeg, you sort of want to know the dimensions you're cropping. So I'll generally just set these up. Strip is a variable that allows me to figure out how many of these slats am I using, right? So if this is 20, I'll show you what the 20 example looks like. If this is 20, you get these larger chunks of video, and you get a lot less sort of like, the twist looks less realistic, like it's kind of clearer what's actually going on here. But it gives sort of this like fun little like more blocky effect, especially you can see it in her legs. Right? So if I make it my strip larger, I'll get much blockier effects. If I make my strip smaller, I'll get more realistic effects. And then this is the offset, right? So in this case where I've set duration to 1, I don't actually want 1 because 1 is going to feel too jumpy. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually saying I just want a single frame. So my video happens to be 23.98 frames per second. So what I want is I want just one of those frames. I don't know what this actually turns out to fractionally, but it's something. If I wanted to say maybe just like half a second, and maybe we can look at this as an example, like just do this and see how these differ. What this is going to do is this is going to give me a much bigger jump between each of those segments. So the way that I sort of recommend breaking down this stuff into Python is you sort of have to I don't recommend trying to write this all at once. I recommend trying to break these down into pieces, right? So the first thing I'm trying to do is I know that I'm going to need to split my video into like a bunch of different pieces, right? So the way that you might normally write this is, let's just say I've got this video and I want to do filter complex. And to break a video into multiple pieces, you would just say, or to duplicate a video, you would say my video, which is this, and then let's say split. And if let's say I just want to split into 4. So I would do V1, V2, V3, V4, right? So how do you programmatically make this? Well, to make this command, what you would need to do is have, well, how many of these pieces am I generating? Which is always going to be height divided by strip, right? So you'll see here that what I have written here is I've written a command that says create this. All I'm saying here is just the video part. Take the video part and then split it into whatever count this is. And I'm using int to basically make sure my value is always an integer. Because if this were, say, like 3, I don't think that works too. So let's say, what is the value? So let's say 7. So you don't want a full, you don't want all this fractional values. That's going to get really messy. And in fact, I don't even know that FFmpeg would read that. So you want to make sure you convert it to an integer. I don't know if I've shown this syntax before. This is how Python allows you to sort of write stuff without using pluses and changing out string values and that sort of thing. So all you do is you add f in front of the string, and then you wrap your value that you're trying to generate in curly braces, and then anything inside of a curly brace can be used Python, and this will generate to a string. So this is kind of nice. Okay, so this alone just gets me this part. Then I need to generate all of these. Oops. All of these various pieces, right? Because at 4, that's like that's human writable. At, I guess, what is 1080 divided by 2? 540. That is not human writable, right? You don't want to write out 540 variables. So what we need to do is we need to do a loop. So we'll do a loop through this count. So we'll do for I in range of this amount. So that means that as this loops through, I will be 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 539. And then we'll save that to this. So this now generates all of these pieces. So let me just turn this stuff off here. And let's just run this. And so sure enough, you see here that we now have a command that goes on for quite a while, up to 539. Again, I probably would not recommend starting at this value. I might start at something like, let's make my strip double the height, and then make sure this outputs to something like readable, right? Okay, so that gives me this piece. Now I want to write this piece. But the challenge is that I want to take each one of these videos and I want to alter this on a per video basis, right? So that is what this next part will be. So we will take this. And so here you'll see I'm taking, again, this range value. So again, 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up until we're finished. Let's actually, what's 1080 divided by 4? 270. Okay, so let's do 270. So this will now take in this video, right? So one of these video values here. We'll then apply the start mode. And the difference here is that instead of setting a duration with a fixed value, we want to set a duration where we change it for every video piece, right? So this is going to take my offset, and it's going to multiply it times my I. So if this were 1 second, then it would start with no seconds, right? So the very first video is not going to have any pad. Then the next video would have 1 second of pad. The next video would have 2 seconds of pad. The next video would have 3 seconds of pad. But because I'm setting my offset to a smaller value, it's going to do the math for me. It's going to take this value, multiply it times whatever I is, and give me my offset. Once I've got the offset, and actually let's switch this to clone. Clone is actually going to look nicer. I realize now that I see how that works. So we'll set this to clone. Oh, interesting. TPAD seems to require updating FFmpeg. So I'm wrong again. You do need to upgrade to the latest version of FFmpeg. Man, the FFmpeg version they use in Colab is terrible. Okay. So once we've got that, now we actually want to crop our strips, right? So we want to take our little strip, which is, however many width or height here, and we want to create this crop. This again will, so our crop is always going to be the full width of the video. So we'll just take the width value here, and we'll use width. So this will be 1920. And then our strip is going to be our height value. So we'll use this value. So we'll use 270 in this case. And then where are we cropping from? So the start X position will always be all the way on the left. And then our strip value will be based on this and I. So the first video will be the very top chunk. The second video will be the next space down. Third video will be the next space down. And fourth video will be the bottom row. So if we run this, I've set some print values here just so we can sort of see what each of these builds up to. Okay, so here is that first part, which is just splitting all the videos, and this part generates all of our clips. Okay, so now we've got all of our clips. The last thing we need to do is stack them. And so the way to do this is to run this. This is just a VStack, right? So all we need to do in this case is stack all of our videos on top of each other. And here again, we're going to set inputs equal to the count of however many of these end up being. So you'll see this value. If I were smarter, I would probably do something like, count equals, and then paste this in here and then use count everywhere, right? That'd be a little bit drier. But in this case, I did it very quickly yesterday, so we're going to leave those values in. So again, remember that VStack takes in an input value or all of your videos input in a row in the right order, and then just stacks them. So if we run this, turn off our combined here. Oh, and I need to print stack. So our last value here is just taking in all those video values and then stacking them. And as you recall, a simple way to make sure that your output works is to not add anything at the end of your concatenated filter. So now we've got these three pieces. We need to combine them all into one command. The best way to do this, I had to play with this a lot last night. I had originally thought you could just sort of combine these all, just like this. For whatever reason, there must be some weird Python sort of like dynamic typing language issue here. You want to wrap this all in a string command, just to make sure everything stays as a string. So when we combine all this together, you'll see this is the full command at the bottom here. Now again, you could probably write this for 4 values and be fine, but doing it for more than 4 values and you're going to start to lose your mind. So I really recommend like sort of starting to build up your Python code like this. It's going to be a little bit easier. So that's what that looked like for 4 commands. If we look at this again, for where the strip was 2 pixels tall, you get this whole thing, which again, no one wants to write that by hand, so don't do it. So now we've got our command written, and the last thing we need to do is actually just run our video here. So we'll just do dance trim, and it's .mov, of course. And then we're going to take our filter. You wrap your filter in single strings. Just if you don't do this, you get an error message. I, again, don't really know why. I guess I kind of know why, but it's just annoying. And then we're going to use that shortest command. Because remember, we've padded each of these videos at different lengths. So some of our video, our last video will be really long. It's got like maybe a couple seconds of delay or padding set in front of it. So we want to make sure that we crop our video to the shortest length. And then we're just going to save this out. And we can go ahead and take a look at this. And I've changed my offset here. So my offset is a little bit longer than that other video that I showed before. So hopefully we get a different result. Any questions about that? I know this code can seem kind of complex. So what I would definitely recommend doing is trying to rewrite it yourself, right? Go through the same process of, okay, I want to take this thing and I want to write some code for it. Then I want to take this command plus a cropping command and I want to write some code for it. You know, this is, again, there's probably ways to make this slightly drier. Actually, there are lots of ways to make this better or like more dry for those of you who are really into dry code. You'll see I'm writing this like range command multiple times. I don't really need to do that. I did it just to break this down easily. But your code doesn't need to even be this dry. If you want to break out the crop into its own second line, you're more than welcome to do that. Like that might help make this a little bit easier to read, right? So whatever works for you so that you understand how it works is more important than like making it feel like the best code possible or like, you know, the most codey code that's out there. So feel free to just, I would definitely recommend rewriting this. Maybe like take another example that you have, or this would be a great thing to talk about during a coding session or a co-working session. If you have an idea for something and you're like, how would I break this down to a Python command? We can definitely do that as well. I would say take a first stab at it, show me where you get stuck, and then we can talk about it.
Derek, I'll just re-up that I'd love to know more about sort of like a on desktop workflow in the next class.
Yeah.
Just because I've been doing a lot of stuff in Terminal, but that's not combining with Python yet, and so.
Yeah, I am not a bash person, but I think what you would probably want to do is you would want to write this in like Perl or something. But I could show an example of how to actually do this. Yeah, I'll show an example of that next week of how to take this code. What you'll actually end up doing is just running a Python script. And what we'll do at the very end is instead of running this command in terminal, we'll actually run this from Python. So I'll show how to do that next week. That's a great example. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, it looks like our video ran. Let's take a look at it. So because I've got that really large offset, or like that slightly larger offset, you get this really much more glitchy effect, right? And this is a case of where like maybe for a faster moving video, that makes sense. Because this is very smooth and sort of like, you know, it's a human-based dance, this doesn't look like the best value. So, you know, maybe what you really want to do to even get even more slower, like more motion effect, is you could actually like slow the video down. That's actually what I did in that other example. Now that I think about it, is I slowed that other video down. I used motion interpolation to so made it like 3x slower. I used motion interpolation to get sort of like similar frames, and then I ran this process on that. So you'll get a very different effect like as you begin to build these things up. So here it's like there's like an old like I don't know, like a Star Trek effect where someone is like being like, what is it, the Metamucil bottle of like over effect. So you get something like that. So again, I think this is a fun effect to play with, and I would definitely recommend playing with it with a video of your own type, because different videos have different effects, right? Depending on the speed of things moving, depending on how different parts move, you get lots of different effects with slit scans. All right.
One other question. I'm actually really surprised that it didn't stop as soon as the first video had hit its end.
I don't think it hit its end. Let's see.
Because, I mean, presumably the first line of pixels at the top has ended a long time ago.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe shortest didn't work. Oh, you know what I bet happened here? I bet shortest doesn't work with VStack in the same way. I bet if we look, that's a great point. Some of these have their own internal methods to change them. Yeah, so I bet we had a shortest inside the VStack. So the way to do that would be here you would set shortest equals to 1. I'll try that later and see if that works. My guess is that for whatever reason you can't set shortest here and have that work. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but because VStack has its own internal shortest method, you might have to set it internally. Glad you caught that, thanks. All right, any other questions? Okay, so let's look at one other method of offsetting video. So this one really only works with looping video. If you don't have a looping video, it is going to be very painful, or it's just not going to feel right. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're actually going to use our trim value and use set points. And I think I mentioned this before, but like essentially what this looks like is, so let's say you have a video, right? And the video is this long. What you can do is you can take a tiny little crop of this video, and then you can take this other part, and what you do is you take this section and you add it to the end of this section. So let's just do this. It's like the most lo-fi imaginable cropping. And you add this to the end. So that's what we're going to do in this video, or in this example here. So let's do this. Let's make it a little bit more readable. Okay, so we're taking in our video. What we're going to do is we're going to split our video into two pieces, or I guess duplicate them. I don't know. I always call this split, but it's like it really should just be duplicate. Anyway, I am not a FFMPEG developer. So we're going to create two versions of this. Video 1 will be our little short clip, and then video 2 will be our longer clip. And we're going to use the trim filter. And the trim filter takes in 2 times. So it takes in what's your starting value, and then it takes in what's your end value. So our first video in this case is going to be 1 second long. So we're just going to take this whole video, I think is 12 seconds long. So we're going to take the first second of that video, and we're going to crop it. So we're just going to take just that trim. I'll come back to this. Our second video, we're then going to take from 1 second, right? So where we ended this video to this second. So we're going to do 1 to 12. So now we're gonna have a 1 second video and 11-second video. And then at the end, what we're gonna do is we're gonna use the Concatenate filter to add them. You'll see I'm adding them in the opposite order, right? If I just did V1, V2, I would get the exact same video back. So what I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna take this 1 second and I'm gonna apply it to the end. So V2, V1, concatenate. Now, if you do that without including this stuff here, it'll be fine in your first video, and then as you begin to stack these, you get into a nightmarish scenario. This is because of that. Remember how I said a video can have a start time that is not 0? This is an example of this. This video right here now has a start time of 1 because I just cropped it at 1 second. So internally, if I were to FF probe this video, which I can't really do because I haven't saved it out, if I were to do this, it would say the duration is 11 seconds, but it starts at 1 PTS. So what this does here, this set points resets all of my values so that I am resetting this to 0. So now if I add this command, if I were to FF probe this video, it would be an 11-second video that starts at 0. So this is a thing you will often see. And it's like one of those things where like once you see a video that does it and you're like, what the hell is going on? You'll kind of figure out what happens here. Basically, as you begin to concatenate these videos, it like takes those position values and does weird things with them. So this is what happens. Just in this case, anytime I use trim, I pretty much always run this. This you don't really need in this case because your trim is starting at 0. But I just always add it just to be safe, because if at some point I change this value, I want to make sure that I've got this. So this is sort of like one of those things where like I recommend just sort of like always remembering that if you're going to use trim, then you want to use set points. So let's look at trim here real quick. Yeah, so trim takes in a start and an end. But what you can do is you can alternately use just that PTS value. This is very confusing. I don't really recommend, like, you can maybe do this if you understand the insides of it, but I generally recommend using start and end as well as duration. It can also take a frame count. It can take other things. Again, you'll sort of see that there's like consistent, like you can use T, you can use N, you can use PTS. Like those are 3 things that generally like most timing-based systems can take in as a time. I will generally default to T, which is a second value, just because it's a little bit easier to sort of like keep in memory. Because N will be based on your frame rate. PTS is again based on whether things are clipped or not. Like it can get really confusing. So this is how this works. We're just going to go ahead. I'm not actually going to render this because it's actually kind of hard. Well, actually, let's go ahead and render it just to sort of see what it looks like. But basically, what you'll see is that my loop video will be offset slightly. So we'll take a look at it just to make sure that it works. Yeah, Stefan. So Stefan mentioned that this is sort of like if you've used After Effects or Logic Pro, where like you take a video and if you set the in value, there's still that whole leader before it, right? It's like a trim value. It still exists, but it just doesn't exist like in render. And that's exactly how FFmpeg works as well with trim. Yeah. Okay, let's see what my video looked like here. Shifted, download. So this was my original video. And you'll see here that it starts at this value, right? And let's see where my shifted video is. We're still downloading. And my shifted video starts here. So if I were to go to 1 second in of this video, I should see that that more or less matches this video. And it does. I'm probably not at the exact 1 second value. But you'll see that basically the shifted, my time is still the same. And if I were to set this video to loop in view, it would still loop. So that's sort of the beauty of like these looping videos, is that you can sort of create this like infinite loop, and no matter where it starts, we'll always loop back to the same point. Okay, so that is how we do this. So you might have looping video that is, more generative or other things, but this is kind of a fun little effect. So I have a wild Python script set here. Again, we can go through it line by line, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you what this outputs to, which is, let's see, so this. So again, you probably have seen this effect now millions of times in this class. You know all my secrets. All we've done is we've taken our video and we've offset the time of the loop, and then we've scaled each version down. So you'll see here when it pauses, this is a great example, that the video, which is in here, is not, the end of this video, which you could look at right here in this corner, is not the same as this, right? And every one of these little like sort of slit scan pieces is not the same, and that's because of that offset. Now, if you do this for something like 100 times, you get this sort of like, 2001 like strobing effect, right? And you'll see like each one of these is a slightly different offset. So let's take a look at the code and sort of break down again the pieces. So first thing we need to do is we need to split this into a bunch of different parts, right? So we're going to split every one of these. So the funny thing is, Stefan asked how long this takes to render. This does not take long. I'll actually run it in class, and it will take a handful of seconds. It will not take long at all, which is one of the joys of FFmpeg. It's very fast. Just doing this by hand in After Effects with 100 pieces would probably take a couple hours. I guess if you know how to do like scripting in After Effects, it's probably a bit faster, but that's a whole other class. So yeah, it would take a long time just to generate this in After Effects. And then your boss says, what if it were 80 pieces instead of 100? And then you're like, oh, fuck, for real? Like, so this is where FFmpeg becomes so much more fun, right? You can now set these count values. You can set this to 2, or you can set this to 80. And then your boss says, oh, can you make it 50 instead of 100? And you say, man, I'm gonna need the rest of the day to do that. You write the script, and then you can like go hang out and like do whatever you want, right? I encourage that. That's fine. No one cares. So we have a count value here. This works very similarly to what we did previously, right? So the first thing we need to do is we need to generate a split. So you need to generate all these different values. And then your next thing is we're actually going to take each one of those videos and split them into 2 parts. So this is essentially this part, right? So we're splitting our video into 2 pieces. So now we've split each video, or we've split the individual video once, or like into our various count files. Then we're taking each one of those and splitting those twice into 2 different pieces. And then we're recombining them with the trim using our offset value, right? So this video happened to be 24 seconds per frame. So I said, give me 1 frame offset for each one of these. So the first video will have 0 frame of offset. The next frame will have, or the next video will 1 frame of offset, and on and on and on and on. Ah, good. Nice joke, Tom. Nice. Very good. Yes, we can pad our time using FFmpeg. We can temporarily pad our time using FFmpeg. So this is just this command here. And all I've done is I've broken it into the individual components here, so it's a little bit easier to read. So the first one is our trim for our first split video. The trim is our second piece for our second split video. And then we combine them. So that's our concatenation, or like our shift phase offset. And the last thing we need to do is we need to do that scaling effect and overlaying effect. This one looks a little bit more complicated, only because this was the last part of our video. What I want to make sure is the very last video in our count doesn't include an output. If it did include an output, I just would have to like map that. I think we looked at this last week, which is like, I guess would be something like V99. The reason I don't want to do this is because then I have to remember like this count has to change based on whatever my count is up here. So instead, all I'm going to do is just like make sure that my last video does not have an output, or isn't being saved to a piece. One thing you'll notice is that a really common debugging issue is that either you add this in, like you have this in as your last part and you need to use a map, or you keep the semicolon. And if you have the semicolon here, it'll also throw an error. again, it feels like FFmpeg is smart in so many ways that to be dumb there is like very weird, but whatever. So just make sure that your very last value doesn't have your bracketed variable or a semicolon, and then you can skip the mapping function. Another very common thing is you will forget this, and then you will get all sorts of errors. So just always keep an eye out for your semicolons, which is why I tend to print this. I might not read every one of these values, but I just want to make sure that, okay, there's a semicolon there. I'm using the correct colons here, that sort of thing. So let's go ahead, let's set the offset value here to be a little bit higher. So let's do 5, and then we'll make our count a little bit smaller. Actually, let's just leave it at 100. That's fine. Yeah, so we can go ahead and run this. That's all the code it spits out. So this last line, which is ungodly long. Again, I'm always shocked that like FFmpeg has no problem with this. That is ungodly long. It just reads it, and it's fine. So we'll go ahead and now run this. All right, let's wall clock this. So 149 at my time. Let's see how long this takes. Any questions while this renders?
No one has questions. I dropped a video of the slit scan on the geometric thing if you want to see what it looks like.
Oh, cool. Let's go there.
Not on an organic thing in Slack.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm exceptionally pleased with it, but I thought it was nice.
Yeah,
and it's also because it has that like single horizontal movement, so it like gives you the staircasing. But yeah,
yeah, that's great. I would also love to see it with less segments, because I bet you would get like some fun waviness, or like again like that sort of like more like almost like sine curve kind of thing. Yeah, it'd be cool.
Yeah, I'm actually rendering out one that's a little bit different, but with smaller segments. So I'll stick that up. I'm doing it just on my desktop, so I don't have to keep uploading and downloading stuff.
Yeah, sorry, that's the biggest.
Varying the segment would be cool.
Oh yeah, that would definitely be cool. Yeah, for sure. All the fun things we can do with FFmpeg. Okay, so that actually finished while I was talking. So it was less than a minute to generate that video. And I'll say like, it actually took me about 20 minutes to write the code and about 40 minutes of debugging. And the debugging was literally this issue, which is like, if you don't wrap this combination in a string, it throws errors, and it took me, actually it probably took me about an 2 hours to like figure out what the hell was going on here. Debugging in FFmpeg is not fun, because you just get a random error message that says like, this thing doesn't work. And it's like, okay, but why? So yeah, make sure you remember this. If you don't, like, you will run into many issues like I did last night. Fine, you're gonna make me open this in VLC? Okay. No? Uh-oh. Why did that not work? That's weird. So generate a video, but the video is like 48 bytes, so that's not right. Let's see what happened here. I wonder. Okay, that's what happened. So there's an issue here. I think this is something that came up previously in class. I made this value too high, that if you actually multiply this, it ends up being 20 seconds, which means that it can't actually, it's doing like a negative offset. So I think I have to make this a little bit smaller. Let me see if this works. So yeah, that looks right. Okay. So I bet that was what the issue was. But it's nice, again, like FFmpeg just did it, and then it rendered a video that was way too small, or like just didn't work right, and it didn't give me any error messages, which is always wonderful. So let's try this again with this length and see if this changes. So while this works, Let me know if there are any other questions. We can talk a little bit about like some fun challenges for your homework if you're interested in trying one. One thing I didn't get to this week, but I wanted to, and maybe toward the end of the week, I'll give people some time to like try it out themselves. And then maybe toward the end of the week, I will come back and sort of show my solution to this. I mentioned Martin Arnold's work before. If you haven't checked it out, I definitely recommend checking his work out. Again, he's not really using FFmpeg. He actually, like, this video or this movie in particular was made literally using an optical printer. So he like literally cut up like physical film. But he's got this cool effect here. And this goes on for quite a long time. Yeah, so you can watch all 11 minutes of that if you want to. But we should have all the pieces that we need to make something like this in our own, using both Python and Python and FFmpeg. So I would love to see people maybe just try, like, you know, you don't need to try to do this with an entire video, but maybe just take one segment and try to do something where you like repeat it. Maybe you're doing some stuff like moving it forwards and backwards. Maybe, you know, you're repeating it, but you're slowly changing the length of it, right? It goes from like a couple frames to like, you know, maybe 5 or 6 about 5 or 6 seconds. So I would definitely recommend, if you're interested in just sort of challenging yourself, try to do something like that using FFmpeg and maybe some Python. So maybe give that a shot while that works and see what you can come up with. I'll try that. I'll try to do the same thing for myself and see if we can come up with different stuff. Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunities here for, like, you know, granular synthesis, like other things. So maybe just as a teaser for those of you who are like enjoy sort of like coding problems like this, maybe try to figure out how to do that. Otherwise, your homework is, you know, to play with that slit scan effect, to play with the time offsets, see what you end up with. I think there's just lots of cool experiments here to do. So I think what Stefan was mentioning, which was like, can you vary the height of those slits at various times? Maybe using like a sine wave or something to like vary the height. You know, maybe similarly, like I did some examples of the that sort of overlay effect, where what I did is I moved them left and right. So like the position of the overlay, you know, being from the center, you get that sort of like, you know, like streaking effect from the center. But if you change the number of offsets and then you also change the position of where it starts from, you'll get different effects there as well. And that's just using, what are we using here? We are using the like overlay position. So all I did was, I believe I set this to the W to 0 or like some other effect. So you can play with different things about that. So play with some effects there. You know, maybe try just different videos. Maybe you've got a handful of videos and you just want to run them through that to see how each video affects the output, those sort of things. Let's see if this finally finished. Okay, that's a more normal size for this video. So it must have just been that because my offset was too large, it threw an error message. So there we go. So that's with a bigger change. I like just doubled the change, and I guess it's moving slower now. I'll have to think about it. Like, I'll have to wrap my brain around why that feels that way. But I also love what's happening here, right? Now I'm getting these sort of like, again, it almost feels like you're seeing it dimensionally. So there's lots of cool things to play with. I'm also noticing I could probably crank up the count and really get like that slit scan effect where it's almost like every single pixel is a different frame. So there's lots of cool stuff to play with these things. And I definitely recommend just sort of exploring. If you're not a coding person, just try different videos and see what different video effects look like. And if you are more into digging into the Python, you can try that and see what you get. So next week is our last week. I've sort of left it open as free space. So I'll definitely cover what Chris discussed, which is like, how do I actually wrap this into a single command, or like maybe in Python, how to turn it into a Python script that I can then run directly from the command line. I know this week was meant to be FFmpeg Python, which is a Python library, that allows, in some ways, makes it easier, but I also felt like it's kind of fun now that we've gotten in the groove of like doing this to actually see it. So we'll sort of see what other people request. Okay, so I'll definitely do GIFs. I'm making notes here for next week for myself here. So text next week. So we will look at Python script, CLI. We'll look at some GIFs because GIFs are fun. I'll also say, like, I think GIF creation in FFmpeg, there's maybe one or two tools out there that are better than FFmpeg, but not many. If you ever use EasyGIF is probably the only thing I think that's better than FFmpeg. The rest of these, FFmpeg is really cool and you can do some fun things with it. So I'll definitely cover that next week. I will, if we don't get to FFmpeg Python next week, what I'll just do is I'll record a video on how to use it. If you're a Python person, you might like it more. But if you're not a Python person, it's just like one more language to learn. So I'll sort of see where we end up with other things. Yeah, so there are some streaming options. I started looking into this. The streaming options are so-so. What you can do with streaming is essentially like if you ever use OBS, where you can like overlay things in different positions, like that's sort of it. That seems like streaming options. I'll look into whether we can make cool effects with this. I would assume you can do stuff with like T, right? You could probably do something like a hue cycling a video, that sort of thing with streaming. But in general, I sort of found that streaming wasn't like the coolest thing. Like there's still some struggles with what you can and cannot do. But we'll look at it. We'll see what we can do. Maybe I'll just stream from my webcam and see what we can get going on. So there's probably some nice stuff there. If there are other things you've seen and you're sort of like, hey, I saw in the documentation this thing exists, but I don't understand how to use it, just drop me a note on Slack and I can like walk through it. So maybe I'll also try to cover maybe a little bit of debugging. As I mentioned, debugging is really hard in FFmpeg. You sort of just have to guess based on the error message it gives you, but I can give you some tips and pointers on like where I end up with things that are difficult or not. Yeah, so if there's any other things that people are thinking about that they want to work on, I'm happy to add stuff.
Derek, you made a side comment about that it might be, I think this might have been I'm worried about if I continue to process H.264s over and over and over again, that I'm going to constantly be degrading their quality because they're encoding over and encoding over and encoding. And it sounded like in one of the things you mentioned that it might actually be sort of decoding in a healthy way before it does these processes.
Yeah, that's a whole area of topic that I'm not super familiar with. So you will often see when you Google something that with FFmpeg, people will say like, oh, you shouldn't do that because that re-encodes it, or you shouldn't do that or this version doesn't re-encode. And to be honest, I don't have a clear answer for like, this is probably a little bit out of my wheelhouse. But I can talk about that, just like what is re-encoding, and what would that affect on the video. If you're doing these over and over and over again, you probably will degrade it a little bit. Some of the stuff we talked about in the very first class, which is that CRF filter, maybe you just want to keep that really high. Was it 0? I believe 0 was the way to keep it high, and 51 was the way to make it low. Maybe every time you run it, you just want to keep the quality really high. That'll probably protect you against certain things. There's probably also codecs that are like, sort of like the Apple Res codec that will like, basically have no compression. That's another solution. So maybe we'll look at some of that on how to work with that next week. In my personal practice, I like to make things grainy and noisy, so I just am sort of like, fuck it, whatever. But I'll at least cover some of the basics of that and just like ways in which to think about it, because the H.264 codec does have compression involved in it. So maybe what you really want to do is just like, generate higher quality uncompressed video until that last step.
I just worry about the temporal compression more than the spatial compression stuff. Like I feel like I can control one, but like if the temporal compression starts to skip a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, those are one of the things where like, to play with and to experiment, it's kind of fine. But yeah, you want to be a little bit clearer about like, how you're saving these out. And that can come into like, that's where a case like these one-liner scripts are really good, because you're doing less of that, like dumping stuff and then using it again and dumping stuff and using it again. So, as I understand, with each of these videos, you're not actually re-encoding things, right? You're not like, every time you change this variable, you're not re-encoding it, so it's not getting compressed or anything. You're not losing resolution, which is why, the first example we did in week 1, which is just like save out a video, then take that video and use it as an input again, like that's kind of a gnarly effect, because you will be recompressing video over and over again, or temporarily losing that sort of like those pieces. So that's where these one-liner scripts are much better, and why you should use the filter complex when you can.
Cool, thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah. Cool. So I have to run. If you have questions or have other topics you want to cover, let me know and I'll add it to our list. And again, if there's things that I can't get to each week, like I'll try to use these as like opportunities to record videos and drop them on my YouTube page so we have them. So even if I don't get to everything next week, I'll definitely cover it in the next couple weeks and drop videos and drop links to them for people in there.
Thank you, Derek.
Thanks. And then one more shout out for co-working session that will happen Monday. I promise it will actually happen this Monday. So I'll drop a note in there about that as well.
Thank you.
Cool. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye everybody.